If Africa truly stood on its own, the world would never look the same again. Imagine a continent that feeds not just itself, but the world. A continent whose minerals power the world's technology, whose oil fuels entire nations, whose young minds innovate at a scale no one can ignore. That is Africa's potential. But here's the haunting question. Why does a land so rich remain so poor? Let's paint the picture. Africa holds 60% of the world's arable land, the very soil capable of feeding billions. In a time when nations scramble for food security, Africa could be the planet's breadbasket. Beneath its soil lies another treasure: gold, cobalt, diamonds, uranium, and rare earth minerals that make smartphones, electric cars, and satellites possible. In the Congo alone, cobalt mines fuel the green energy revolution, yet the miners themselves often work barefoot, earning just enough to survive. And then, its people. Africa is the youngest continent on Earth. By 2050, 1 in 4 humans will be African. Think about that. A tidal wave of youthful energy, innovation, and labor power. The future of the world doesn't just include Africa, it depends on it. But when you step back, the contrast hits hard. Wars tearing nations apart, leaders toppled in sudden coups, crushing debt that grows heavier each year, streets filled with youth unemployed, frustrated, and desperate. So who benefits from keeping Africa in this cage? Here's where the story darkens. Once upon a time, control came through colonial armies and gunboats. Today, it comes in polished forms: aid packages, peacekeeping missions, development loans. The chains are softer, but just as binding. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund extend loans to help African economies. But hidden in the fine print are conditions: privatize your water, cut subsidies for farmers, open your markets to foreign corporations. The result? Local industries collapse, farmers can't compete, and nations spiral into deeper dependence. The United Nations, meanwhile, presents itself as the guardian of peace. But who holds the real power inside its walls? The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, none of them African. They alone can veto resolutions. Imagine that. An entire continent with 1.4 billion people silenced at the stroke of a pen in New York. And then there are the peacekeeping missions. Blue helmets march in, not to solve conflicts at their root, but to freeze them in place. Wars linger, resources remain unstable, and foreign powers continue to exploit the chaos. It's not always through bullets anymore. Sometimes it's contracts signed in marble halls. Sometimes it's men in suits, smiling as they call it partnership. Now imagine something radical. Imagine if Africa broke free of these chains. What if African nations refused conditional loans and built their own financial institutions? What if they created a single currency backed by their gold and oil? What if they united their armies under one command, protecting their borders not from each other, but from external exploitation? The balance of power on Earth would shift overnight. Suddenly, Africa wouldn't be a continent begging for aid. It would be the world's powerhouse. Prices of global commodities would no longer be decided in London or Paris, but in Lagos, Johannesburg, and Nairobi. And that possibility, that dream of unity, is the world's greatest fear. Because a truly independent Africa doesn't just change Africa, it changes everything. So ask yourself, why are African leaders who dream of unity so often cut down before they succeed? Why are movements that push for independence painted as threats to stability? Is it because instability serves someone else's interests? The sad truth is this: Africa's destiny may no longer be stolen by the roar of guns. Today it is stolen in quieter ways, through loans, contracts, vetoes, and polished speeches in the name of peace. But what happens when millions of young Africans, no longer silent, begin to see the system for what it really is? Because the question that hangs over the future is not whether Africa has the power. It does. The question is, will the world ever allow Africa to truly use it? She was called fearless, unapologetic, dangerously truthful. But her truth came at a price. When Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao opened her mouth, she didn't just speak. She detonated bombs of truth across the global stage. And when the dust settled, she found herself alone, staring down the very powers she had exposed. To understand why her words carried such weight, you have to know her story. Born in Zimbabwe, raised in the shadows of colonial rule, she grew up with first-hand knowledge of what it meant to live under a system that stripped away dignity, land, and hope. She didn't just study oppression, she lived it, but she was determined not to be defined by it. After moving to the United States, she pursued medicine, becoming a respected physician. She built hospitals, served communities, and earned recognition, not only for her medical skill, but for her relentless commitment to uplift others. Her journey was the kind of story we love to celebrate. The African girl who rose from the scars of colonialism to success on the global stage. And it was precisely this credibility, this lived experience, that made her words impossible to dismiss as mere conspiracy theories. When she was appointed as the African Union's ambassador to the United States, she stepped into the arena not as an outsider, but as someone who knew both worlds, the corridors of power and the dusty roads of African villages. And when she spoke, it was with the authority of someone who had seen the system from inside. Then came the moment that changed everything. In speeches that went viral across the internet, Dr. Arikana pulled no punches. She described in detail how France had maintained its grip over 14 African nations long after their independence. The deal was simple, but devastating. These countries were forced to deposit as much as 85% of their foreign reserves into the French treasury. In return, Paris would hold their money, giving them access only to a fraction of it, while charging fees for the privilege. Can you imagine? A child in Cameroon goes to bed hungry, while his nation's billions lie untouched in a foreign bank vault. A cocoa farmer in Côte d'Ivoire works under the scorching sun, producing the beans that fuel Europe's billion-dollar chocolate industry, yet he cannot afford to send his own children to school. A miner in Niger risks his life in uranium pits, uranium that powers France's lights, while his own village remains in darkness. Gold, oil, cocoa, diamonds, uranium. The lifeblood of Africa flows out, and in its place, poverty remains. And as Dr. Arikana's words spread, millions across Africa felt a jolt of recognition. She was saying what so many had always known but never heard spoken aloud by someone at her level of authority. She wasn't just whispering dissent. She was naming names, exposing contracts, and tearing the mask off the face of neocolonialism. Her speeches spread like wildfire, from university halls in Ghana to bustling markets in Nigeria, from rural villages to glittering capitals. Young Africans shared her clips online with hashtags like Free Africa and End Francafrique. She became a symbol of resistance, a modern-day whistleblower. But here's the twist. Instead of rallying behind her, the institution she served, the African Union, moved swiftly to silence her. Why would an organization meant to defend the dignity of Africa silence its own ambassador? Why would a global system, supposedly built on peace and justice, turn its back on truth? Was it fear of confrontation with France? Pressure from international powers? Or was it proof that even Africa's own institutions remain entangled in invisible chains? Emotional contrast, alone against the powers. Picture it. One woman, standing alone on a stage, microphone in hand, her voice echoing against the weight of centuries. Behind her, billions of Africans who felt her words in their bones. In front of her, the invisible gaze of nations whose wealth depended on silence. It was cinematic. A David versus Goliath battle, except this time, David wasn't armed with a stone, but with truth. Yet truth can be dangerous, and when wielded against the most powerful interests in the world, it can cost you everything. Her dismissal wasn't just bureaucratic, it was symbolic. A message to anyone who dared to speak too loudly. This is what happens when you challenge the system. But the irony? Silencing her only made her message louder. Her dismissal became proof of the very conspiracy she had exposed. And across Africa, people began to ask themselves, if her words weren't true, why did they terrify the powerful so much? Dr. Arikana's revelation was more than a scandal. It was a mirror held up to the world. And as millions stared into that mirror, they began to see not just France's hidden hand, but the silent complicity of global institutions. Because if one woman's voice could shake the system, what would happen if an entire continent refused to stay silent?